Adrian, it's all yours.
Thanks, Adam, and welcome everybody. I have the pleasure of introducing Amrita tonight. And before I introduce her and Drew, I would like to introduce the lecture sponsor, which is very important. Support for this lecture is generously provided by Nan and Su Xiao Endowed Lecture Fund. So thank you so much for your generosity in the support of this lecture. Okay, tonight we welcome Amrita Mahindroo to USC. Amrita is an architect, urbanist, and writer holding a degree from the University of Melbourne and a degree in architecture and urbanism from the MIT School of Architecture and Planning. Amrita's research is focused on the implications of the macro on the very tangible questions of the shape of our cities, architectural tectonics through industry and human experience. She works closely with local communities and education institutions, including urban youth initiatives through workshops in schools, to create strong public engagement on each project with a consistent view to co-create. Amrita has a breadth of experience in both private and public sector projects with a particular focus on collective housing projects, mixed-use programs in hospitality, contemporary art museums, and urban regeneration plans. Amrita has had the opportunity to lecture, teach, and publish widely across the US and Europe on her research, including places such as the Royal Academy of Arts in London, the University of Melbourne, Cambridge University, UCLA, University of Pennsylvania, UNC, University of Oklahoma, and MIT. Her practice, Drew, is an award-winning emerging practice founded by Amrita Mahindroo, and Michelle Da Costa Gonçalves. By engaging the human within the macro, the studio bridges urban research and design to conceive active built environments during an era of deep social and environmental responsibility. It brings together the complex strata of context, both intellectual and physical, through metrics that we all share. Questioning emerging technologies, environmental and social change in our cities, Drew works with sensitive, highly contextual projects, considering adaptive reuse of heritage structure. The office engages with social and climatic sustainability through the notion of time, by bridging the dilemma between the urgency imposed by today's deregulations and the legacy of long-lasting projects to create a durable cultural contribution. Working from the object to the urban, from furniture to the city, each scale is an opportunity to exercise architecture as an art, a useful art, which questions our habits, changes our behaviors, and helps adapt to our finite resources and shifting political landscapes as an active canvas. Each project is at once a tailored solution to the design problem at hand, but also part of an overarching body of research which engages the community and is an armature for social and environmental agency. Please join me in welcoming Amrita Mahindroo to USC School of Architecture.
Thank you to this school here and to Harry for the invitation. It's an honor and a little bit of pressure to be opening a series titled Architecture Engaged. Sorry, I don't have it. Then you get it wrong. Sorry. So underlying in this statement, architecture engaged, is how in a world so riddled with problems can the practice of architecture, not building architecture, find its relevance? How can it make a difference? The hard truths: a heating planet, increasing social inequalities, poverty, inflation, often come wrapped in multiple layers of subjective truths. Questions of identity, politics, definitions of heritage, and definitions of comfort. It is not always instrumental to confront the hard truths at a systemic scale. However, they provide a compass when we engage with the more subjective ones through mediums specific to architecture. These subjective truths are cultural constructions, for example. Housing design in guidelines in London suggests the appropriate amount of space for a family of 4 people is roughly 3 bedrooms and 900 square feet. In Tokyo, the average family home is 600 square feet. In Australia, the average family home is almost 2,000 square feet. It is in this sliding scale of relativity that we found our practice to be most engaged, in that awkward space which negotiates the strata of what actually shapes our built environment, those which make up the complexity of our societies, what make our cities interesting and our projects challenging. And to understand this shifting ground, we've learned that over the last decade, how much there are no consistent answers, no absolutes, no manifestos, not even finished works, but rather fleeting states of completeness. But that doesn't mean we bend with the wind. What drives us is a critical pursuit of a shared cultural contribution to produce work which innovates, is intrinsically participative in the narrative arc of the history of a place, and history full stop. There are themes which resurface: cultural referencing, spatial and typological economy of means, material research, a fascination for the thickness of walls and envelopes, and a process of co-authoring. But no two projects follow the same route. Almost all of our work is in cities, and somehow most of it is in complex or contentious situations, a sort of creative friction. Cities which are oscillating between rapid change and preservation, those which are struggling to house their growing populations, and are characterized by both extreme wealth and extreme poverty, sometimes only streets apart, sometimes within the same buildings. Cities where often the hard truths are wrapped in multiple layers of relative truths at the scale of a handful of streets, between neighbors and communities, between households and families, between the powers of commercial growth and the history of a place. And it is through the subjective truths that we engage with the hard ones. The ugly plan is an analogy for a project which critically synthesizes the conflicting needs of context, but acts beyond circumstance. This is an ugly plan. This square, the Campiello Morosini, is an ugly plan shaped by its relativism. It is more than one square. It has been co-authored through time by accumulated conditions. Each intervention had its own identity. Every gesture was strong and important, and yet each gesture worked in coherence with its predecessor, like a chess game. It is many versions of itself, depending on which vantage point it is experienced from, and more importantly, it is whole and extraordinary at every scale of experience. It is the ugly that we endeavor to in our work. Projects which can't be isolated from their intangible or physical context, but it's not to be awkward. It's because engaging with the strata that make up the cities that we've been working in, it is near impossible to create an absolute or autonomous work. All of our work is a conceptual point of departure, which remains open to its own multiplicities. I'll explain through example. We recently won a student housing competition, which demonstrates this thinking through a series of observations. UPP is a major student housing provider in the UK. They were looking for a fresh take on how to rethink student housing in the wake of COVID. Following years of switch learning, wherein more than a third of classes take place online, students had also changed. Many of them were dealing with serious challenges around mental health and well-being. And it came as quite a shock to return to a college environment where they were present. Students, like many of you, aren't a simple social category. We see them as complex, diverse individuals who have their own quirks and some baggage. Despite growing financial challenges, we increasingly see students breaking away from the linear timelines of education and then employment to pursue creative endeavors during their studies. And so more than a test bed, we saw that student housing was a space to nurture these opportunities, to try, test, and accept to fail within the comfort of your home. An ecosystem of reuse, co-op employment, associative activism, NGOs, or even small businesses. Ideas are often developed in the corners of a room, in the spaces which allow for the improbable encounter of the outwardly and the introvert, where an experiment can remain undisturbed for a number of days or even months. Ideas build up in the recesses, in the corridors or thresholds, and gather informally over time. There is a circular economy to students moving through housing year after year. They hand down old tech, bike parts, clothing, furniture, and share knowledge. We saw the common space as a large market hall of individual alcoves to conceive, make, create, and display. A bike repair shop or a co-op fruit and veg market, maker spaces for shared classes and learning, an articulated frame around student-run projects. The alcove exists as a threshold condition between the communal and the private, equally applicable to the market as it is to the apartment. The brief required apartments to have a 13 square metre room with an ensuite, or 140 square feet. We envisaged 13 square metres made of personal nooks for individual purposes, a space of one's own alcoves which foster the freedom to change and adapt, to create more undefined space which allows you to think, stretch, dance, sprawl, and create. Malleable in proportion, these rooms aggregate as modules, pooling spaces to gently nudge a sense of communality. Modules cluster to form buffer space, an inclusive space for people with different social skills, offering adaptability, informality, and inclusion. Creating an apartment that offers rooms within rooms, alcoves, nodes, and knuckles of opportunity. Spaces which foster habits which affect systemic changes, sharing of goods, prioritizing well-being and mental health. As walls thicken to meet the highest sustainability standards for passive design, we often explore the opportunities this depth presents in a number of our projects, which takes me to Paintworks. Paintworks instrumentalized its context and a series of commercial accidents through robust opportunism to create help to buy housing that goes beyond the metric needs of development. The site was an existing warehouse with a car park behind it, something that I've seen quite a bit of here in LA as well. The existing building needed an extension to be viable, and the question was which way, up, down, sideways into the car park. Effectively, for the developer, it was all of the above, and therefore it forced us into a project where we were negotiating with multiple uses at a compact scale, but also multiple neighbours, and this very pretty garden, which we borrowed from Hackney College. Our work became a game of who came first. A quick word on planning permits in the UK. Planning in the UK is based on time and precedence. There is a rule book, a rough code, but most of it is a negotiation. If you are effectively, the game is to acquire rights that set precedents in terms of space, or use. This logic is combined with notions of light and privacy, but I'll come back to that later. When you place even one window across this boundary here, we're effectively carving into the value of our neighbours' property, which means that we're taking away space that they can develop in the future. Why is this important? Because in absolute terms, this facade would have been entirely blind. However, for the benefit of the residents, we negotiated to limit Hackney College's right to future development by putting windows along this planted car park. Our justification was that Hackney College was unlikely to develop their site, having done so in the 1990s, and that housing requirements effectively trump all other programs currently. So if you're improving housing, if you're creating affordable housing especially, you effectively get to buy the rights from your neighbours to develop in the future. The residents also benefit from an improved communal spaces because of a series of commercial accidents, which were designed into a communal game. The client had secured a major supermarket as a tenant for the ground and basement floors, and they wanted the largest unobstructed footprint for the site. We convinced the developer, in the interest of the tenant, to give part of the street frontage of the entire building to the core, which is pretty illogical when you consider commercial value of street frontage. That freed up all of the south elevation, which is to the rear, through the entire building to allow for better living spaces, balconies, which were screened from the street, bedrooms and various other functions. Improving the condition of the apartments, but also reversing the logic. Halfway through construction, the supermarket pulled out of their tenancy. This happens all the time. They had found a better deal elsewhere. However, the core was now built in its particular location with a lift shaft and windows already in place on the street. This commercial accident resulted in a particular communal gain with a well-lit and airy circulation space for housing, which now doubles as communal space where residents occasionally gather. The result is a communal area which benefits residents and also frames the surrounding city, providing vistas into the gardens of the neighbouring social housing block, a strategic access to borrowed green. The challenge to an evolving and intangible volume is that the architectonics tend to emerge at another scale, usually a smaller scale, and in most of our work in housing, this is in the thickness of the facade or in the windows, the threshold that we delight the most in designing. The proximity of all of the neighbouring properties meant that there was an inevitability of privacy issues to address. In order to address passive design, we increasingly see building envelopes become thicker with double insulation packages, absorbing structure, MEP, services, fire curtains, barriers, and blinds. The thickness presented an opportunity to create a double-layered internal space within the windows. The large-scale slab-to-slab windows let in light and frame dramatic views across the city. The alcove that they create, which they extend to the slab boundary, creates a sense of privacy and actually offsets some of the heat gain. The windows hang like picture boxes onto the cinema that is the city, whilst creating an intimate and individual scale of the experience within the alcove. The very idea of time and continuity informs a lot of our work and a lot of our efforts to source and reuse materials. The rain screen is made of a recycled stone and resin compound with concrete building waste mixed in. It has a crumpled paper texture as a nod to the history of the building as the paintworks, which was a former artist supplies warehouse. We've been working on building waste composites and terrazzos for almost 8 years now, but they present significant challenges in getting approvals for fire certification for multi-residential work. And so in this case, we had to use building waste from another site, which was unfortunate, but nevertheless. The ugly plan is about an intellectual flexibility, but also opportunism and some convictions, the compass I was talking about earlier. We were required to maintain utmost flexibility because the client flip-flopped on various potential tenants. At any given time, we were working on almost 4 concurrent planning applications alongside construction, which could have been a 3-story building or a 5-story building. The project was delivered a few years ago, and we were called 3 months ago because the planning regulations are changing again, and they would like us to extend our own work. The ugly plan is a metaphor for a time-based negotiation of contradictory and sometimes frictious forces. The often chaotic process of co-authoring, which comes from many parameters and multiple stakeholders. Our work has to depart from a conceptual base which is strong enough to hold the project's identity, but be flexible enough to evolve with this chaos. In the other corner of London, in literally every aspect, is Castle Lane. About 300 metres from Buckingham Palace, Castle Lane is home to some of the wealthiest homes in London. This conservative pocket is extremely resistant to new development. This is proper NIMBY territory. Our clients wanted an urban approach which would show both sensitivity and innovation. The block navigates about 3 streets and a neighbouring pub. On one side, it interfaces mansion blocks, which are effectively 5-story apartment buildings, and on the other, 3-story Victorian terrace houses. The number of complaint letters were in the 2 digits, which for something that's a reasonably small development is actually a lot of vocal neighbours and a lot of heightened attention from the local authorities. Permitting this site took 2.5 years. I was kind of hoping for dramatic effect at that stage, but I realized here in LA, that's what it takes to get a house through planning. So anyway, coming back to planning law, every existing neighbouring window has the right to a virtual cone of light and views, a little bit like New York. Every line we draw redefines this cone. It expands or contracts, shifts shape. This makes the task of having a sense of visibility on what you're drawing almost impossible. And to add to that level of complexity, at least that cone, or at least some portion of it, can actually be purchased from your neighbour. And alongside this, there is a sort of ambiguous, unscripted notion of privacy, which is just something to be understood about the British. Every design decision is an iterative negotiation with the city, various stakeholders, and with ourselves as designers. The result is this sort of in and out carving of volume. So this gap at the back here of the lower scale comes from a covenant which was agreed by this neighbor and this site about 100 years ago, and it's been written into a contract, which means that it will never go away, and so we had to sculpt around it. When we carved in other parts of the site, it was because of basement windows on the other side, but it was something that we could purchase or not. Everything comes down a little bit to how well you get along with your neighbors. And you can see the way the volumes had to sculpt in and out to deal with that. So our approach was to absorb that complexity into a unique typology, which was drawn from its context. A space that inhabits the thickness of the facade, a sort of hovering volume. Halfway through, there is little in the way of scale which is coherent. However, the most consistent features across both streets were the traditional English bay windows, as you can see here. So we sort of immersed ourselves in the context by rewriting the formal grammar of the surrounding bays. We studied both form and shape, and this became a point of departure to design a window typology, which was flexible enough to slip and shift shape and negotiate the many urban interfaces in an innovative way. Beyond the referential form, we wanted to create something that was a unique spatial experience as well, and which sort of augments the very idea of a window. So this typology explores the window's spatial thickness and also suspends it slightly outside the volume of the building so that you have this impression that you're hovering above the street. We worked extensively with Arup's Advanced Facades Lab to study the window bays on how to localize and hide distortion. There are moments where the curve contracts and others where the distortion expands to assist in increasing privacy. How to manage heat and light diffraction so that we wouldn't melt cars with the windows. That happened in London some years ago. And we also studied how to create a counterform which would address the convex areas where we had to carve out volumes to respond to the localized planning conditions. This became the definition of the aesthetic for the townhouses, which were the smaller buildings and a series of smaller individual homes which interface the Victorian terraces. We also carried out an extensive amount of research into terrazza composites for this site, using a mix of materials from building roof tiles, bricks and cement-based building waste. The composites, as you can see in some of the colors over there, produced a series of panelized materials which were really interesting. However, for reasons of certification, we were unable to use those for this particular project, but we studied the brickwork in the neighboring context extensively to develop those panels. We're actually now using them on some smaller domestic projects because that's less complicated. So just a little kind of input here. I think we aren't always designing for the momentary dramas, although it might seem like that when you're sort of dealing with neighbors all the time and you have to come up with ideas to respond to that. But we do navigate them, and our work has to be innovative beyond the kind of drama that you deal with on a daily basis. And so our objective is to create a sort of legacy through that built work, the kind of legacy that the existing bays had left in the fabric of the city. The research we do on one project often gets carried over to another. The concept had to resist the push and pull of the mass and the envelope, and the typologies would have to adapt between floor plates and be a grammar which was open to its own iterations. One of the things that I always tend to come back to is that architecture is really slow and laborious. In addition to ourselves, the design team consisted of almost 27 consulting companies. We had the usuals, MEP, structure, etc., but also bat consultants for urban wildlife, for how to consider how bat populations might be able to occupy the buildings as well. and consultants who were dealing with the Queen's estate, which was 300 meters away and had nothing to do with us, but nevertheless. I think the result is a series of suspended bays which dialogue with their Victorian counterparts, a process of building on the grammar of the site and to navigate the ever-changing complexity of the urban conditions. A concept which brings us to Deauville in France. Deauville in Normandy is a city of architectural follies, a 19th century playground of the elite. It is defined by a heavy-set, extravagant Ballier architecture made of large roofscapes in timber frame construction, with rich, idiosyncratic Belle Epoque typologies and volumes of stacked roofs and deep eaves. So how do you work within this context when you don't have the same set of means? We were approached by the city of Deauville to work with them directly to create a mix of social and private housing. The split was 50-50. There are significant challenges to the stigma of social housing within the same complex of housing for sale. The reality is that when social housing gets built in close proximity to private housing, the value of sites drop. And here the city was asking us to mix them. When we think of social housing, we think of an aesthetic uniformity, the idea that everyone gets the same sized unit and the same sized window, a sort of aesthetic leveling field which solves problems. But the problem with this homogeneity is that it ghettoizes social housing against the heterogeneity of private housing. And so we wanted to make sure that the units could not be told apart. The sort of equity versus equality argument. We wanted to create a sense of the individual within the collective, and based on another thick facade, we wanted to create a sense of I live here, the treehouse. The treehouse volumes move with the larger and smaller scales of the surrounding urban context, engaging with the site's history, its imbricated scales, and its coherence as a whole. Once again, the volumes of the surrounding context require certain distances from boundaries, but now that we are in France, these rules are absolute. There's no negotiating, it's just black and white. The project is made of a street building and a courtyard building. Units are mixed across both buildings and have terraces or winter gardens which project out along the either southern or northern facades, depending on which way they've been staggered. They are connected by an internal common bridge, which offsets the cost of not building an additional core. Saving that money allows us to create an unexpected and meaningful space which can be shared by everyone. It sort of creates a covered veranda, which provides protected space to the children's playground, but also creates a bridge with an extra wide corridor space, which allows for well-lit and ventilated common spaces, which we've found to be some of the core needs of social housing, because it allows to communities to foster, to gather, to kind of form communities, because people can speak with each other in a safe space. The T-shaped plan creates a series of residual gardens. Can you see that okay? Or it's loading. The T-shaped plan creates a series of residual gardens. So those forms effectively come from the urban conditions. The courtyard gardens between residents are designed with their own series of programs. So you have the central garden, which is kind of more for picnicking. The children's playground is a crucial one because it creates a node almost externally, which allows for both social and private housing to share that space. And as we found in a lot of research, children are one of the best places for adults to socialize around a playground and to break down social barriers about one person who's living in one set of housing versus another. And then there are productive gardens, which are for vegetable patches and individual private gardens. We also retained the existing ruins of some of the sheds on the site to create mini tree houses, which the children could use. Beyond the units, we also see life taking place in the thresholds, including in the thickness of the facade. So you see this deep veranda that kind of surrounds the entire volume. That space is where we seek to find a balance between a highly defined and expected program, the spaces that are looser and where more unexpected events can occur, The living tube, which I'll describe here, is effectively this clear span which creates a transversal space between north and south, allows for passive ventilation of the apartments. And that space is only made possible because we've compressed a lot of the surface areas, so bathrooms and kitchens, etc., into joinery or tighter walls, which work a lot harder. I think as demonstrated in our student housing proposal, which I explained earlier, there are two typologies of space, those which are engineered through prescriptive norms and standards, bathrooms, kitchens, wardrobes, which suit the size of a hanger, or rooms which suit the size of a bed. And then there are spaces of freedom, as we like to call them, corners, slightly oversized corridors, alcoves where a desk can be placed, which empower people with a sense of choice. And that choice we've found to be a measure of quality. It provides people with a sort of indirect sense of self-worth in their homes. These project along the north and south, which provide an additional sense of light conditions depending on which way you're facing. And the thickness provides a level of protection to the internal spaces from wind and wind-driven rain and coastal storms. The building is designed entirely to be low carbon, ethically sourced CLT construction. It's clad in marine treated burnt accoya with a paint stain to increase its durability and allow for modular offsite construction. I think the idea was to create a sense of forms which would be based on the materiality and the typological forms that are driven by climate and context at the same time. But not all projects come with context that is tangible, hard boundaries, neighbors, or planning processes. Over the next few, I will talk about how the philosophy of the ugly plan translates into architectural processes, which are defined by more intangible contexts. So we're presently working with a charity in Australia for emergency relief housing for at-risk single-parent families. In partnership with technology company Six Sides and a major hardware retailer, Bunnings, we are designing tilt-up passive homes for a demanding subject in a very demanding climate. The site is presently a trailer park. It's in a high humidity rainforest where the biggest problem is the cost of getting water, heat and sanitation out to each house. The conditions aren't conducive to an ugly plan by virtue of an open site. However, we believe in translating some of the intangible context, the traumas of the various families that would be in need of relief housing. So our negotiation is more an introspection of Bunnings. The question came like, what does a single parent family need? Usually another parent or another adult who can help them look after their child from time to time, or can at least be watching them for moments. And so for us, what seemed most important was to create typologies that would stick together to create a sense of community. Minimal doesn't necessarily have to be a compressed way of designing expected spaces. And for us, that meant defining priorities. In this case, that priority was to offer a safe space for children to play, but remain supervised. So creating a sort of external playroom. That basically means having to forego some of the elements like removing doors or walls and compressing bedrooms to offer a better minimal, a minimal that contains an outdoor space that connects to other modules, a sort of undefined central core that allows for alcoves, again, to create the bedrooms so that we can erase corridors and in between spaces. And that allows for a parent who might be fairly distressed to be able to easily access or see their child without necessarily having to be in the same space all the time. Our base model was for 36 square meters. And so we created a series of external decks which help ventilate the units. All of the windows open onto the decks only, which creates a sense of privacy. And because the decks are covered, they also offer, effectively become external rooms. These decks pair with a neighboring unit and become a shared space that other homes effectively connect to and can therefore assist and create a sense of community. The units loop around to create an internal courtyard, which is more of a scaped landscape that allows for the exterior of this block to remain completely rainforest, which we don't want to create sort of models which effectively create a new sort of sense of sprawl. This courtyard assumes a sort of civic role for the community when enough households share that space. But sometimes that friction of context is in its scale. Or a matter of time. Marion Place is a master plan proposal for that perfectly awkward scale between architecture and urbanism. It's too big to be building and too small to be architecture, to be a city. It's where we offer mass, typology, structure, and have to build in difference into our own work. We have to build in time, basically, to create an articulated sense of immediate urbanity, which appears like it was naturally aggregated over time. The site is a decommissioned British gas brownfield in Bethnal Green. It does not have any street access. It's effectively an enclave. And so we had to cut streets through it from the light industry that surrounds it. The upper floors, the program is for 350 homes, a library, a daycare centre, urban farm, sports facilities, the usual that goes with 350 homes. The project takes a base volume of 5 stories across a cluster of buildings to create public squares to insert civic onto the ground plane. The upper floors are offset to create new external spaces across the upper stories, a process of returning that borrowed ground. The volumes are twisted and offset to achieve the required FAR, but that twisting echoes the silos of the site's history. It animates the volumes and frees up sunlight into the courtyard based on the various orientations of the gardens. The result is multiple green spaces and new gardens, which are at a more accessible level for higher placed units. And it interfaces with the various scales of development on the surrounding sites as well. The ground plane courtyards are designed in different ways depending on the interface of what they're connecting to. So in some cases that's housing, in others that's light industry, which needed a different kind of design resolution. It's a unique process for us to relinquish control on how much we define and design, knowing when to stop and to create space for a different set of authors to join us. And so part of that diagram or that twisting volume was to imbue a sense of architecture into the massing so that kind of negotiated that scale. And it's this particular scale between architecture and urbanism that is the set of frictions which define the ugly here for us. Sometimes, very rarely, that friction is an absence. A program and a site, sure, but a condition which is completely alien to our sensibilities. That friction is a significant lack of urban quality, wherein a site was meant to be experienced only from a vehicle, and we have to create a sense of civic within it. So this site is in Seoul. It's stranded between a 6-lane highway, towers of housing blocks which sit like islands in a sea of unscaped terrain, a golf course, and a building which is partially a kindergarten and partially a school to one side. There's also a campus somewhere in the distance. Everything is very far apart and with almost no connection. So there's a sense of time to that one too. Our proposal for the Songdo Public Library mediates that sudden transition from the flatness of the low-lying ground plane with the intense verticality of the towers. The volume drags up the landscape, and we positioned the sculptural side to the perimeter so that that transition is designed to be experienced from a vehicle. It creates a centralized public space to the interior in the form of an urban park and a water reservoir. The library is a series, sorry, these drawings are going to take a bit of time to load. It's a series of stepped plans, stepped contours, which effectively house all of the shelves for the library and create the auditorium. Within each plan, there are a series of subspaces or more intimate programs, reading corners, study desks, and shelves, layering complexity into the spaces of those individual contours. It's resolved, the journey through the library is resolved through a series of plates, and the balustrades are created by the shelves at each level, which creates that sense of density. The building uses its shape to also create a naturally ventilated wind chimney, which pushes up the warm air through the building and allows for the volume to raise up, kind of explains how the volume raises up to one corner. It's designed in large span CLT, and the roof is also a catchment for water, which is transferred into the reservoir below the children's playground, which then irrigates the park. So just some images. The result is a theatrical cascade of shelves towards the landscape park at Cascade, which uses the civic program to force civility into that absence. So there is civic, that is the holy grail of architecture, and then there is the civic that we fight to keep in many of our projects. This plan is of a church that we're currently working on, which is presently under construction for the Caribbean community in North London. I would love to say that this plan was a prominent building that I could show you lovely renders of, but this church is in a basement. It's in a basement because of the symbiotic needs of the church, the inherited civic use of the site, which was championed by local authorities, and the commercial pressures to densify the site. Sometimes the only way to keep civic programs within the communities in which they exist is to squeeze them into a layer cake of other programs which ensure mutual viability and mutual architectural benefit. I won't show you other drawings. The residences above look into the church's gardens. So guess where this youth club is? No one's paying attention. In a basement too. London Youth is a charity which supports youth clubs all over the city. They are effectively facing some challenges and have started selling their sites because of reasons of care and maintenance. And therefore, they have come up with quite a strategic strategy to secure their future spaces through legal agreements and planning permits, which ensure that they are guaranteed rent-controlled space as a part of the permitting and sale agreement. Now, the site in question is in Dalston. You might recognize it. The site was effectively a windowless, unheated portal frame shed. And in the completed project, it will be a windowless, unheated, heated basement. However, it's going to be designed to the requirements of the youth club. So today, this site is effectively a layer cake in construction. You can see here in progress. It's a gymnasium, a community youth club under Makers Studios, and then with Help to Buy housing above. The corner site is wedged between a neighborhood pub and a series of terrace houses, which are to Cecilia Street on the other side. In order to address the transition in scale between streets, we offset the volumes of the larger footprint through a series of lodges, which you can see here, or internalized balconies, which address the varying alignments surrounding it. The result is a series of articulated volumes with a crafted textured brickwork to uplift the very rough context, some might argue. A process of squeezing architecture out of the tightest budgets, and above all, to provide quality homes with a minimum of means, something that we often are challenged with. The charity would not have been able to remain in its place without the housing program. This process of retaining a civic use as an offset gain from commercial pressure is a negotiation that we're often dealing with. One we're often faced with in many of our larger Retrofit projects, which I'll talk about next, where often this is the only way to stop a larger listed building from becoming derelict. So many of our larger retrofit projects are subject to a process of stitching together buildings and sometimes separating them for the coherent or logistic movement of multiple clients and operators inside one larger building. The Town Hall Hotel is one such story of multiple operations under one roof. But we like to think of it as multiple stories of past and present, where the building presents itself differently according to your vantage point. For most, the story of a building that was celebrated, lost, and then regained its pride. Here are pictures of the grand opening that we found when we started doing the archival research. It's a story of the London Borough of Bethnal Green, which was a fairly working class neighborhood, had first opened their town hall. Following the consolidation of a number of London boroughs in the 1980s for cost and administrative reasons, the city's town halls and other public buildings became derelict because they could not afford to maintain them effectively, and the government decided to begin auctioning their sites. The Bethnal Green Town Hall had been a derelict film set for almost 15 years before it was purchased by our client. He was bold enough to buy an extraordinary building which required a behemoth amount of work and money to refurbish in a neighborhood that was kind of rough around the edges at the time. It's quite a bit more gentrified these days, but it sort of, and it was a few too many stops east on the Central Line. The building is entirely listed down to the ventilation grills. Our work was to insert 98 apart hotel rooms, 2 restaurants, a bar and a swimming pool into the 9,000 or 900,000 square feet development. Of the 700,000 square feet of existing building, we only demolished 90,000 square feet. 90,000? 90,000. No, 9,000. I do meters. 9 square meters. How many square feet is that? 900, right? Yeah, sorry, that's a big 900. Yeah, so 1,000 square feet. Oh no, it can't be 1,000. That would be 100. No, I'm talking 90 square feet is what we demolished. Yeah. In addition to providing the private apartments, the primary challenges were to maintain and use the council chamber and the beautiful meeting rooms as public spaces, which could work independently of the hotel. One part contemporary extension and another restoration, we had to come up with a strategy of reversibility, which would allow us to dialogue between the old and the new, and in the most sensitive and respectful way, which was innovative. The former users of the building were the planning officials, and a journey which began with a complete refusal of the change of use ended up with their recommendations for the various awards the building was to receive. The project was engagement through and through, with authorities to explain our abstracted ideas, with local communities to explain our process and listen to their stories, to co-create with them, and with the building's past and its future uses. We poured through archival photos to reinstate parts of the building. The conservation process was crucial to its reinstatement, and our work was both interpreting and adapting to extend the life of the building's existing fabric, but also maintaining its patina and creating a third era of its history. And so we drew on that when we moved into its next chapter. The cladding was a derivative of an Art Deco ventilation grille in the building, which was reinterpreted into a contemporary pattern, which adapts with varying light conditions and privacy as it moves across the building. The 300 linear meters of facade, I don't know how many square feet that is. You'll figure it out. It's long. It changed to adapt to the internal and environmental criteria. We discovered that openness was a factor of intricacy rather than size. And there were sections which were entirely informed by computer-aided design and fabrication. This exercise in digital craft created the most material efficiency and resulted in it being the least point of contention with the contractor. There were so many other things that they struggled with. And also this particular type of method was selected because it allowed us to propose something which was reversible. It can entirely be removed in the future, and if the building is to be refurbished by another architect or another person in the future, it doesn't impact what was considered the listed character or the listed parts of the building. And it doesn't come with the same permanence that a mineral solution might have. So you can see here parts that have been stitched together with the existing fabric at the back. Right, and some of the studies which took place to find the right geometries to work with. Okay, that's loading. So coming back to ugly plans, we love ugly plans. The main administrative halls and the high character rooms, we had to be logistically organized so that people could move through the building without necessarily interrupting the hotel functions. And a big part of this was actually making sure, like the way that we got the permit was making sure that those rooms were open to the public for a certain amount of time through the month. In order to deal with many of the high character rooms, we used a sort of spatial furniture typology, which allows us to bring in MEP services, all of the plumbing, the air conditioning, the various individual programs, including kitchens in some cases, that don't touch any walls because those walls are all listed. So all of the skirt boards, the cornices, the windows, everything. This meant that we were compacting everything that was serviceable to a room into these pods, which float within the high character rooms, as you can see here. And so we make the joinery work really hard. It does lots of things. At the same time, often bathrooms are encased within a room which floats outside of the larger fabric. In other areas, the work on the interiors was much more to do with just pure refurbishment. It was to do with pure refurbishment and considering a new era of the design, so interpreting some of the interiors and finding a new way of translating that into contemporary design. And in some cases, we found some surprises. There was a drywall in front of this, so we had no idea that this extra space existed and it hadn't been surveyed, so it kind of became an extra room once we discovered it. And we wanted to make sure that it was experienced at a different scale, so we actually created a double-story space, which meant that you could actually experience the ceiling close up and a lot of the ornate plasterwork. The introduction of the swimming pool was very challenging, but we also reworked services into the pool area through these ventilation grills and the lights, which do the same kind of interpretation of some of the existing fabric. And we collaborated with artists to introduce a sense of humor and sort of create works which would further the spaces and enrich that experience. So this is with Arts Admin, a local charity that works with local artists to promote new artists that are not known. So by law, the building is given back to the public for a certain number of hours, but also by refurbishment, because had it not been refurbished or had this work not taken place, it would have remained derelict. So the main hall now once again hosts weddings, seminars and assemblies, and it reinstates civic life back to a building which lay empty for almost 2 decades. So now, not all definitions of heritage are the same, and what is deemed listed and considered of value is also changing with time. The HAM, the Hôtel d'Activité Masséna, is a vertical factory in Paris, which houses a range of different light industry businesses. They fabricate ceramics, wool, and a bunch of other things, like craft industries. The building design is poorly suited to its orientation, and the current uses for fabrication of ceramics means that it suffers immensely from overheating. It was designed by Arte Charpentier in the 1980s, and the building needs a full refurbishment and recladding to address its thermal performance. Our proposal was to use the existing exoskeleton, once again, a somewhat over-engineered structure, to hang a canopy, and a secondary canopy structure which made of recycled and extruded terracotta, which folds into the cladding as a planter box to help with the overheating and the urban heat island effect. The recladding improves the thermal performance. All of the windows will also be replaced, and it also provides shade to the south and west facades, improving the heat that the building is dealing with. This was also an opportunity for us to revisit some of the earlier research that we've been carrying out into circular economies and the reuse of building materials, which went into Castle Lane, as I'd explained earlier. But this time we're working with earth and terracotta and the resulting project. Right, almost there. So the next project is a story of perseverance. Beyond its particularities in terms of program and reuse, the project is particular for us because we've been working on it for 8 years on and off. It's had several stops and several clients in the making. Some 8 years ago, we took part in the original bidding process for the sale of the former Fulham Town Hall, during which we produced our first short high-level study for the transformation of the building into a boutique hotel. First client, first iteration, 46 rooms. The purchase was lost to another higher bidder, who eventually went through a difficult planning process, as a part of which they produced an analysis of our documents to justify their approach. Their permit was refused, and the owner wasn't happy about it, so they went to an appeal. Some 4 years after that, after we began our initial concept, we were approached by the city this time to work for the city to justify why their appeal was unjustified. So effectively create a counter argument as an expert witness. Second client, this time the city, second scheme, 62 rooms. Their appeal was rejected, which means we won. And then the building was sold again. So kind of went into the ether, we forgot about it. And then we were reapproached by a third client, or more exactly multiple clients this time, for now a 90-room hotel scheme associated with co-working spaces, conference facilities, exhibition spaces, and a hospitality venue. This very short summary ignores the twists and turns of each phase, but illustrates the incredible versatility that the existing structure has and the relativity of each approach. In short, we ourselves have been rethinking our own work on this building and reconsidering how to densify. As time passes, the financial viability of renovating a building like this becomes more challenging. The cost of construction increases, and so with every client came the new challenge to squeeze more in. So much to say, there isn't really a correct answer for any project, not even for ourselves. And the success, what was deemed success of the project, changed every time. The Fulham Town Hall is located in West London. It's a branch star-shaped plan and presents two very different facades to the street. It's set within a typical row of Victorian terraces, but also the commercial hub. The original Town Hall building, which is here to the centre on Fulham Road, was includes council chambers and a concert hall, and was built in 1888 to 1890 by George Edward. The Harwood Road wing, which is the building over here, was later extended in 1904, and then there's the Fulham Road extension, which is to the side here and to the back as well, which was built in 1934. So the building is already a stitched structure. It's entirely listed, so grade 2 star, which is actually a level up from the previous project. It has great historical prominence, and it stands an example of late Victorian and Edwardian architecture. A large number of the architectural features and artifacts are also entirely listed. So in some cases that might be like a light or a handle or a sign that you can't touch. Effectively, you tiptoe around this building, terrified that something will fall down and you'll be responsible. The history of the building is such that it has accommodated a variety of functional requirements and has been developed in response to various site restrictions. And this has resulted in the characteristic changes. So it has the various ages that's significantly noticeable. The volume and level of ornamentation can be seen within the overall structure and a complex circulation system throughout the building. So this is a fantastic toilet if you're ever visiting. They don't get better than that. A tribute to historical buildings is that they have a lot of fat on them. They were designed without the sort of absolute efficiency of the contemporary fabrics within which we work often, and it allows for an immense scope for absorbing new programs. The over-engineered structure, this is actually from the 60s, but that became listed too, and we have no idea why. But every time somebody put something there, it became listed. So we're looking forward to our listings. The over-engineered structure leaves a thickness within the fabric that allows for the integration of contemporary technologies. It allows us to improve thermal and acoustic performance and adapt spaces which were not originally designed for certain purposes into new functions. There's also the distinct approach of designing architectural events, which comes with these large programs. So the way these buildings were originally designed is that you build a really big, important room, and you build another really big important room, and then you connect them with whatever shaped space you need to connect them. So it's pretty messy. Some wonderfully ugly plans and some very big important rooms. These rooms are a series of big events. The rooms that have a hierarchy and they're positioned for their size in proportion to the facade, to an access to the street, light, mass, and centrality. And then they filled the gaps between them with whatever shaped corridors they needed in order to make sure that space would be connected. And they also come with this philosophy of exuberance. It's an exuberance of eclectic styles that allow you to deal with an odd shaped corner. If something doesn't align right, you put a column in front of it, or you decorate it with a little bit of frill. You paint it a bit brighter, and it allows you to get away with just about anything in terms of space. That process of connecting and stitching, a sort of quilting, is what's guiding our work. So our work is currently ongoing. I don't have a complete project to show you, but it's something that is entirely without form. It's sort of exercise in interior urbanism in a way, a sort of promenade through events. The particularities of the Fulham Town Hall would completely resist a formal synthesis. So we are having to stitch parts of extensions to find that financial viability into the building. And as with most developers, you have to sort of squeeze it into wherever you can. That makes sense for the historical fabric. So we're sort of performing a surgery in a way, and adding bits of new building inside the crevices between the existing one. That architectural challenge was to reveal a grand but introverted building beyond two ostentatious facades on Fulham Road and Harwood Road. And due to its historical intricacies and richness of spaces, the details are often hidden to public view. So some of the challenges that we've faced is every time we've sent a surveyor to survey the building, the existing building, they've forgotten significant sections. They've left out a staircase or forgotten an entire window which might have been boarded up, which means that we're constantly discovering as we work. We decided to play with because of that complexity, we decided to play with this idea of a volumetric echopraxia, which is a sort of every contemporary edition tries to mirror the tumultuous and secret roofscapes inside the listed building. there are a series of textured white volumes which kind of emerge, and we can hide parts of our architecture. It will almost not be visible from the street. Like, it will only be seen from a particular angle, from a window in a particular room. And it's creating a series of secret interventions, which are more like a series of installations. So as the roof goes up in one corner, you might see it visibly from another. And it's reinterpreting some of that white terrazzo in a series of new composite terrazzos. So as you see here from some of the rooms, you'll be able to see roofscapes or stone chimney work, which will otherwise not be visible. And then through some inserted circulation spaces, you'll be able to discover parts of a facade which is visible from the opposite side of the building. So you experience it as a stained glass window from the interior, and then you'll experience that same space up close from the exterior. So it's a process of revealing a building, which in some areas would not be visible. Sometimes our work is just surgical insertion of fire doors, for example, but doing that with a sensitivity to the existing fabric. So finding ways of creating geometries that actually work with the existing fabric of the building. And in other cases, it's returning to that idea of the furniture pods. So the room that is spatial furniture and effectively built entirely free of its walls. And in this particular case, reinterpreting some of that relief tiling in new ways so that we can create new typologies of space, but what reference the history of the building. A number of the larger rooms will be converted into restaurants and other public functions. And today, these rooms are being used as exhibition spaces, as a test drive for future exhibition spaces, so that they can generate some awareness about the building within the community, and they have access to it in its current state, and so that it can kind of prep the ground for what comes next. I think the project seeks to revive a local icon. We've just received the planning permit on this and the listed consent. We had an overwhelming amount of support because the building has been shut for almost 15 years, I think, as well. And that is something that is consistently done through engagement for us. You don't gain support for projects like this without spending an immense amount of time with the community, without speaking to people who live within those streets, who are the neighbors, people who have been using these buildings for a long time for their own purposes, and people who have established a relationship to this and who for the most part will feel like this is going to change that neighborhood and not in a good way. And that support is something that we really fight for. We spend an immense amount of time with the communities trying to create a sense of ownership for them, which is where I'm going to finish. So most lectures close on the most significant success of a practice, but I'm going to end on one of our most important failures. Our team with Hinahan Peng architects were recently amongst the finalists for the International Slavery Museum in Liverpool earlier this year. The museum is an incredibly ambitious project, a layered and complex brief to tie 2 Grade 1 listed former dock buildings to house the International Slavery Museum, the Maritime Museum, and create a space for contemporary Black culture. The challenge was how to make these museums relevant to the community in Liverpool, to engage simultaneously with the history of the transatlantic slave trade, a very hard, ugly truth, and to engage also with a series of subjective stories, or the stories of the people whose lives have been shaped by that history and the nations whose identities have been formed by that history. I ate, slept, breathed this project for 8 straight weeks, and we didn't win, which is fine. David Adjay won. He has some clout. Our most important exercise in design for the ISM was this co-creation plan. It's a plan which outlines how we would co-create with the community of Liverpool through every phase of the project's conception. This is the first time we've done anything like this. We sort of feel our way through that process. But this was putting it down on paper, looking at our methods and also looking at what was workable with people who don't have design training, who don't work in our industries. I think the ugly plan, I think as you've now understood, is a metaphor for empathizing, for accepting a creative process which is in a constant to and fro of both relinquishing control and creating powerful ideas, which translate that empathy into the sorts of experiences which move us, which leave a legacy. It's an astute awareness that we share this creative space with people that need to believe that we've understood them, where they're coming from, and why the projects we're doing belong to them in many ways. Our work is engaged, however, it isn't journalistic. It isn't holding up a mirror to the news of the day. That news is too fleeting to maintain pace with the painfully slow process of realizing architecture. It's slow to build and it's slow to disappear. For every project we realize, there is a litany of work that never sees the light of day. Many people who practice feel the same way. Whilst a film or a book can be put within the context or the historical context in which it was written, buildings often have to transcend their historical contexts. They have many shifts in perception, and the longer they last, the longer they have to adapt to behaviors and programs. If our work relies on being interesting solely because of its programming, then how is it going to be interesting when that program leaves? As many of our projects have tried to demonstrate, the most robust architectural contributions that we've made are those that have the potential, the heterogeneity of offering of scale and typology in proportion and frequency of openings, light to mass, literally windows and mass, are the only ways that we allow the programs to change over time. Buildings which are conceptually and tectonically strong enough to be given value, to be retained. Buildings which will change for the reasons, beyond the reasons for which they were conceived, but will hopefully be respected for their design intent in much the same way that we respect the work of those we refit. I think architecture needs to exist first as a cultural medium which observes and embraces our complexity. It builds on our history for all of its warts, engages with the world around us for what it is, but not only a mass of problems to be solved. And is a canvas to the evolving social and political stage, because it is going to change. It changes too fast. And for it to be relevant, it has to be an active canvas, but not because of the polemics that surround its conception. It needs to be active through its material means. Powerful because of the semiotics people can attach to it with time, and because it moves us at a much more fundamental corporeal level. I'd also like to introduce Michelle, who's the other half of our team, the genius behind all of this. And yeah, thank you.